To say the tight end position in week 1 was a hot pile of garbage would actually be an understatement. So let's keep the glass half full and just say there's room for improvement for the tight ends heading into week 2. But will we actually see that improvement? Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? The tight end position greatly underperformed in week 1, but the good news is that I gave you several players that actually finished inside the top 12 at the position last week. Now, it wasn't really that difficult, but if you listened here, you actually probably did well given what the tight end position did last week. So let's get right to it. I know we all have to try and figure out what's going to happen this week, so let's take a look at tight ends for week 2, and we head into Thursday Night Football with the Vikings and the Eagles. A matchup of two really good tight ends here. And for TJ Hockenson, it is going to bring my underdog pick'em to play this week because the current line of 5 receptions for TJ Hockenson, I'm going to hammer the higher on that one. Since TJ Hockenson was traded to the Minnesota Vikings, he has had at least 5 receptions in 8 of his 11 games. And he's coming off a performance in which he saw 9 targets and 8 receptions. He is absolutely getting plenty of value. Now, he might not be getting a ton of big plays, but he is absolutely the safety blanket for Kirk Cousins, who's going to be looking for him if he can't find Justin Jefferson or Jordan Addison right away. And this is a matchup where if the Eagles put up a lot of points, then Kirk Cousins is going to have to keep throwing it. And the Eagles last week gave up some pretty decent numbers to Hunter Henry, and then Mike Gesicki added a few catches as well. This is absolutely a number that I'm going to hammer the higher on, and if you want to play this pick'em with me, then you got to download the Underdog app. Use code word Headliners when you sign up, and you're going to get a deposit match of up to $100 and a special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit for all new people that sign up using our code. And Dallas Goedert is coming off a performance in which it felt like Jalen Hurts just forgot about him. I can't imagine that that continues. Now, coming off a performance like that, it does bring a little bit of risk with it, and that's why I'm going to highlight Goedert in yellow this week. And Minnesota only allowed 3.9 fantasy points to the Tampa Bay tight ends last week, but they didn't really utilize them either. So I can't take a whole lot of that information and say it's absolutely going to happen this week. I do believe Dallas Goedert bounces back. Is it a super high performance? I don't know, but I'm willing to go back to him, just assuming that there is going to still be some risk associated with it coming off such a poor performance last week. Green Bay and Atlanta is going to bring a matchup, a couple of really good young tight ends. One, he's ascending, Luke Musgrave. The other, Kyle Pitts. He just continues to lose value. I don't know what's going on there in Atlanta, but let's start with Luke Musgrave. Last week, the Atlanta Falcons allowed some pretty decent points and a touchdown to Hayden Hurst. Luke Musgrave last week, if he just could have kept his feet under him, would have had a much bigger week, but he did end up sliding just inside the top 12 at the position. I do believe that Luke Musgrave may not end up seeing the volume that we would love, especially if Christian Watson ends up playing this week. But given the fact that Atlanta allowed a touchdown and a few receptions to Hayden Hurst last week, we could definitely see the same kind of outing for Luke Musgrave this week. Kyle Pitts may have averaged 22 yards per reception last week, but he only got 2 receptions. The volume to the wide receivers and tight ends, and really just the passing volume as a whole in Atlanta right now, is not there. They love to run the football. Drake London got 1 target last week. Kyle Pitts, I believe, only ended up having 4 targets, but only caught 2 of them. It's just super frustrating to watch because the Atlanta Falcon pass catchers are super, super talented. Now, does Atlanta care about fantasy? Absolutely not, and I don't expect them to. And if the game plan to run the football over and over really works, then go ahead and let them. But at some point, I feel like they're going to have to utilize the talented pass catchers that they've added there. And Kyle Pitts is one of those guys. Now, does he see the volume that we would like? Absolutely not. But if he can keep averaging those type of big plays, he won't need a ton of volume. We just need to get him a few more catches. If we can get him around 4 to 5 catches per game, it could put him inside the top 12. But our hope is is that he can start scoring some touchdowns. For the Raiders and the Bills, and on the Raiders side of the football, they drafted Michael Mayer, but in training camp, all signs pointed to Austin Hooper being the tight end that would be the only one that might be fantasy relevant. And even he isn't fantasy relevant. Right now, they're just not utilizing the tight end position. Now, that could change this week, given the fact that Jakobi Meyers may not be out of the concussion protocol by the time kickoff gets here. If that were to happen, then Austin Hooper might have a little bit of touchdown upside, given the way this offense will operate. But it's not enough for me to actually feel like, hey, there's a low enough risk here that I'm willing to dive into either of these guys this week. Dawson Knox and Dalton Kincaid worked out exactly how we thought it would. Dawson Knox is playing the true tight end position on the line, while Dalton Kincaid is playing out in the slot. These guys almost average the same exact routes ran and the same exact snaps played last week. Both guys were utilized in the passing game. However, when you have Stephon Diggs and you have Gabe Davis and James Cook is seeing an increased role, how much volume does actually go that way? When you look at Dawson Knox, you gotta hope for touchdowns. That's going to be his claim to fantasy stardom this year. If he can score, that's great. Now, unfortunately, Josh Allen threw a trio of interceptions, and they didn't really get an opportunity to work in the red zone that often. So if they do this week, maybe we'll see a little bit more into what the game plan will be with Dawson Knox. For Dalton Kincaid, he's going to be the volume guy in between the 20s. If I had to pick one of these guys right now, Dalton Kincaid has the better opportunity to be safer, given the fact that he probably sees more targets on a consistent basis. For the Baltimore Ravens and every fantasy owner out there that drafted Mark Andrews, my hope is that he can go this week. And going up against a Cincinnati team that allowed a touchdown and just over 15 fantasy points to the tight end position last week, Mark Andrews would definitely be a guy that we're throwing in our lineup. Now, there is some risk associated with it. We don't even know for sure if he will play as of this recording, and we're keeping an eye on how healthy he will be when he gets out there. But one thing we learned last week, and I brought this up in the live show, when we found out that Mark Andrews was out, everybody started running to Isaiah Likely as a top 12 option. I had him outside my top 14 tight ends last week. I just wasn't sold on him putting together a performance like we saw last season, and it didn't happen. So if Mark Andrews were to be out in this situation here, we would reevaluate it, but I don't know if I'm just willing to go back to Isaiah Likely given what we saw last year. Irv Smith saw 3 receptions last week, but that offense as a whole just did not look good. Joe Burrow had a lot of rust. He was able to hopefully shake some of that off. Hopefully he has a really good week of practice, and they come out and they're a lot more competitive going up against Baltimore this week. Am I expecting Irv Smith to have any type of a fantasy relevant performance? I'm not really banking on it quite yet. The opportunity is definitely going to be there, but given what we saw from the offense last week, I don't think Irv Smith will be worth the gamble in week 2. Seattle and Detroit, and no Travis Kelce last week, obviously threw a little bit of a wrench into the Chiefs' game plans, but Noah Gray was still able to find the end zone against the Detroit Lions. And it kind of got me thinking about Will Dissly this week, but unfortunately, I just couldn't bring myself to do it. When you've got wide receivers like DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, JSN, when you still got some backup tight ends there that you're going to see in the game, when you've got a running back duo like Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, it just doesn't leave enough opportunity for me to even feel like there's a little bit of risk to start Will Dissly. He's going to be on the bench for me this week. It was an interesting concept to potentially look at, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it this week. Sam Laporta caught all 5 of his targets last week for 39 yards, and maybe those numbers don't make you feel super tingly inside, but you know what? There's a lot of really good opportunity there for Sam Laporta. I talked about this in my waiver wire episode when I mentioned his name as being a guy that we could pick up, and it's the amount of snaps that he plays because he is such a good blocker. He was one of PFF's highest rated run blockers last week at the tight end position. This guy is constantly on the field, and if you're constantly on the field at the tight end position, even if it's in the run game, it still could give you an opportunity because Jared Goff could come to the line, realize, hey, we've got to check out of this. He could call a pass play. Laporta's already going to be on the field because they're going to be using him to block. So even though there is going to be a little bit of risk continuing to start a rookie tight end, if we can continue to get him at least 5 targets a week, that could start leading to a little bit more upside, given the fact that Sam Laporta can break off some pretty big plays at times. Indianapolis and Houston, and Kylen Granson is a really interesting prospect for me this week at the tight end position, because if you look at the numbers from Anthony Richardson last week, he really worked anywhere from 0 to 10 yards past the line of scrimmage. The game plan last week was to find his players in the short to intermediate range and give him a high percentage of pass completion plays that he could carry out with a lot of one looks or go through his reads quickly. I don't mind that at all for Anthony Richardson. And what that could end up leading to is more targets for Kylen Granson. We looked at Josh Downs a lot last week. Michael Pittman was the wide receiver 1, but given the type of matchups that we could see coming up, if they utilize this game plan more and more, it's going to put Granson out there for a lot of potential targets. Now, don't forget, we got my boy Mo Cox, Mo Problems, Mo Alley Cox there as well, that's going to be seeing some snaps at the tight end position. So Granson isn't safe by any means. In fact, if there were to be like 4 tiers of colors in this episode instead of just 3, he would probably be 1 away from the bottom. He'd probably be like an orange instead of a red. But in this instance, I still think that there's some opportunity there if you play like in a deeper league or if you're really, really struggling at tight end right now. Now, Dalton Schultz could end up being the safety blanket for CJ Stroud, and that's kind of how we talked about him in the offseason. But my worry always was, is there going to be a lot of big play potential there, given the fact that you've got Nico Collins. Robert Woods showed up out of nowhere last week as well, by the way. He actually took some of the role that I was expecting to go to Dalton Schultz. So that might be the biggest issue for Dalton Schultz, is that Robert Woods is working the intermediate portion of the field. But in terms of big plays, you got Nico Collins and you've got Tank Dell, and they're still going to be running the football as well. So hopefully they stay a little bit more balanced this week. And if they do, Dalton Schultz is going to be a guy that, if we're only seeing like 2 to 4 targets a week, it's just not going to be enough, especially if those receptions are only turning into 1 or 2 yards per reception. Kansas City and Jacksonville is going to bring my Manscaped must-watch matchup of the week. If you head on over to manscaped.com and use code word headliners, you are going to get 20% off your entire order and free shipping at checkout. So make sure you head on over to Manscaped and use that code word when you get ready to place your order. But listen, Travis Kelce, even though he's coming back from an injury, there's no way I'm placing his name in yellow. If Travis Kelce plays, he's in your lineup and you don't give no F's about anybody else around you. You play Travis Kelce. There's nothing else to say other than the fact that Patty Mahomes, given what happened last week with his wide receivers dropping footballs and being so inconsistent, if Travis Kelce plays, he's probably going to see 95 targets this week. But I'm also going to have Evan Ingram in green as well, because one thing I saw when looking at the Jags film last week, which I did as a members only video, for those of you out there that are not members and have considered it, those are the type of videos that we do that are behind the scenes. But Evan Ingram was still out on the field, and he replaced some of those 3 wide receiver sets that we saw last year, because they did a lot of 12 personnel, but they would put Evan Ingram instead of on the line kind of out in the slot. They're doing some different things with him right now, and because of how much they have him on the field, he's going to be one of the safer tight ends that we can play any week as of now. Did Cole Kmet have an outstanding week last week? Absolutely not. Did his 6.9 fantasy points put him inside the top 12 tight ends? Absolutely it did. That's just a testament to how bad the position was last week. But you could tell the Bears offense just wasn't all there. Maybe the Packers defense is just a lot better than we anticipated. Maybe it's going to take a while for them to shake that rust off, just like a lot of other teams in the NFL. Maybe the Bears offense will just be a lot worse than what we thought. Whichever one of those options come to fruition, Cole Kmet is still going to be one of the main guys that Justin Fields is going to look at. Between him and DJ Moore, that is where the targets are going to go to. Now, Moore didn't get a ton of targets last week because he was shadowed by Jair Alexander, but Cole Kmet could still be a guy that gives us 5 to 6 targets a week, but we have to hope for that touchdown upside. But last week, Tampa Bay allowed 8 receptions on 9 targets to TJ Hockenson and the Minnesota Vikings. So could we see kind of a performance like that, where maybe the targets and the receptions are really nice, maybe the yards don't reach as high as we would like? That's okay. I'm still willing to go that route. Cade Otton is probably at least number 4 right now in terms of receiving targets on this team. Now, he could go anywhere between 3 and 4. I think Trey Palmer is going to be a guy that makes his way to 3. Chris Godwin, Mike Evans will still be the focal point of this offense. We'll see if Baker Mayfield starts to look towards Cade Otton a little bit more. Me personally, I think he becomes a little bit more of a red zone threat, meaning that the volume probably won't be there. We would just have to hope for a touchdown each week, but he's not at a point right now where I would even consider starting him. The Chargers and the Titans bring a lot of what ifs at the tight end position. People all off season long, Gerald Everett was probably the one name that got brought up the most, saying, Kyle, why isn't this guy inside your top 12 or 24 tight ends? Where is he ranked? Why aren't you giving him more respect? It's exactly because of what we just saw. You've got Keenan Allen. You've got Austin Eckler, who is banged up. We don't know if he'll play this week. You've got Mike Williams. He was banged up last week. You've got Quentin Johnston, and Darnold Parham was still there. And I think that's something that a lot of people forget, that last season, the tight end position was really kind of a flux back and forth of 3 different guys. Now, the reason Gerald Everett stood out so much was because guys like Mike Williams and Keenan Allen were missing on a consistent basis. That's just not happening right now. If there were to be injuries again, then maybe we look at Gerald Everett as being a starter one more time. But as of right now, given the fact that there's so many pass catchers there, and Darnold Parham is a guy that they're really looking to utilize in the end zone for his touchdown ability, I just can't go with Gerald Everett. And then my boy Chigi Oko, he saw, I think, 1 target was all it was last week, which is super unfortunate because given the fact that Ryan Tannehill was struggling so much, why didn't we utilize Chigi Oko a little bit more often? Let him utilize some of his athleticism on those short passes to pick up some yards for us. Now, does that happen this week? My hope would be yes. And the Los Angeles Chargers gave up a ton of passing yards last week. So the hope is that they would utilize that this week and maybe put up some decent yards as well. But I can't risk it. Not with Chigi Oko, not right now. When they added DeAndre Hopkins, I know that was going to be a huge hit to Chigi Oko's potential volume, but I wasn't even anticipating the hit that we saw last week. And until I see that tick back up, I'm just going to take my shot on some other options instead. Now, Darren Waller was a little bit of a disappointment last week, but the New York Giants were a disappointment as a whole. And this matchup here is a lot more fruitful for them, and hopefully they can figure their crap out because there are a couple guys that we would like to have decent fantasy weeks, and Darren Waller is one of those. I'm going to leave him in green. Even after just a tough performance last week, if you own Darren Waller, unless you own like a Travis Kelce or a TJ Hockenson, there's not a whole lot of guys that I'm willing to play over him right now. Hopefully he continues to see targets. Hopefully they stay in the game long enough to keep their starters out there, and he should put together a decent fantasy performance for you this week. But how about Zach Ertz? This is a guy last season tore his ACL, didn't even know if he'd be ready for this year, comes back and not only ends up playing week 1, but sees 10 targets from Josh Dobbs. If you're looking for someone on your waiver wire right now to toss in at the tight end position that can at least give you a decent floor, Zach Ertz is going to be the cheapest option that you can do that with. And given the fact that Josh Dobbs could be looking his way, even if we get 8 targets a week for him, that absolutely is going to put him in the conversation for top 12 performances every single week. The 49ers-Rams matchup has a pair of disappointing tight ends from week 1. Now, George Kittle, even at one point last week, was said that it was highly unlikely that he would even play, and he still ended up going out there. Now, maybe he was banged up and not 100%, and that's why he wasn't as utilized as what we would hope. It was the Brandon Ayuk and Christian McCaffrey show. Maybe that just didn't allow for that to happen. But in this matchup, my hope is that we do see George Kittle back to 100%, and we can get him back to some of those bigger numbers that we saw last season. Even if some of the volume is a little bit lower, we can get him in the end zone. Now, Tyler Higbee and the Rams, I thought that he would have a much larger impact last week than what he did. Again, Not a bad performance given the fact that he finished as a top 12 tight end, but not great given how bad most tight ends were last week. And when you take a look at everybody else that was utilized, I knew that Puka Nacua was going to get himself some targets. He was filling that Cooper Kupp role for Matthew Stafford. But Tutu Atwell having the day that he did, that one kind of caught me off guard a little bit. I thought at least Tyler Higbee would be the 1 or the 2 last week, and he ended up being the 3. So we'll see if we can get back to some basics with him this week, get him some more targets. But given how tough this matchup is, we might need to be getting the ball out very quick if we're Matthew Stafford and the Rams, and that would help Tyler Higbee put up some better numbers, even if the upside isn't that high. It took all of 4 plays for the New York Jets season to come down in shambles. Now, they got a huge win and they rallied to come back against the Buffalo Bills, but they're going to have to rely on Zach Wilson now, and I don't know if they are prepared for that. We'll see if Tyler Conklin gets himself back into the mix now that Zach Wilson is back under center. We know at times last season, Tyler Conklin was looked at a little bit more often, and that was really kind of an up and down performance. We'll see if he finds any consistency whatsoever, and that could be 4 targets a game at this point, but we'll see if he can find any consistency with Zach Wilson, who will now be under center. Now, Jake Ferguson saw 7 targets, so the numbers that you see on screen might be a little misleading, but I am not willing to bank on it quite yet, especially in a matchup against this New York Jets defense. This is going to be a really tough matchup, and everybody in this matchup is going to have some risk associated with them, given how tough the Jets defense is. Now, for the Cowboys defense, they could also take a stranglehold on this Jets offense as well. This could really end up turning out to be a very low scoring game, with maybe some defensive points being the one thing that separates a win and a loss. So offensive players as a whole in this matchup, I'm just not loving their upside. Last week, I was not interested in even contemplating the fact that we could start Logan Thomas. And then he led the Washington Commanders in targets. That's pretty big for Logan Thomas, and that's pretty big for his potential moving forward. Again, kind of like a Zach Ertz. Maybe not a ton of upside there, but if you keep giving these guys 8 to 10 targets a week, it makes them fantasy viable and inside the top 12 conversation every week as well. If he becomes one of Sam Howell's go-to guys, then at that point, we are going to be looking at needing to start Logan Thomas on a weekly basis. I'm not ready to go there as of yet. He does have some mid-range risk for me this week, but if you're scrounging for a tight end, Logan Thomas could get those targets once again. If you were hoping Greg Dulcich was going to do anything for you this season, Adam Troutman stepped in with his buddy Sean Payton and said, not so fast. And then unfortunately, Greg Dulcich went down with an injury last week. So now it's only going to be Adam Troutman. Now for Troutman, is he a guy that we maybe see utilized a little bit more now if there's no Greg Dulcich? There's some potential for that. Maybe not enough to get me excited, but that's something that we'll keep an eye on. Now, if Jerry Jeudy comes back and plays this week, yeah, there's no reason whatsoever for us to even consider Troutman because he might not see nearly enough targets to even be in the conversation. But once again, it's just one of those things that we're going to have to keep an eye on. We knew Miami was going to be good on the offensive side of the ball, but look at the New England Patriots. Mac Jones looking like the first rounder that he is last week against a tough Eagles defense. And now these are 2 teams that could just go right back to trying to throw all over each other again. Now, for the Miami Dolphins, their tight ends are definitely interesting because we saw each of them get 5 to 7 targets last week. It's not enough to get me excited, though, given how much they threw the football against the LA Chargers. Now, if the New England offense doesn't get back to where it was last week and we see some inconsistencies with it, Miami's not going to need to throw the ball as much as they did. They're going to run the football a little bit more. So really for those 2 guys, you would be banking on some type of a touchdown. And I'm not willing to bank on that just yet because they didn't do anything with the tight end position last year. However, my boy Hunter Henry goes from a guy last week where I'm like, listen, I like the opportunity, but I want to see it for a week in game first. And then we saw it. I'm putting him as a green guy. We're starting Hunter Henry. He should already be on your roster. And if he's on waivers, you need to go pick him up right now if you don't have a top tight end. Miami allowed just over 15 fantasy points to Chargers tight ends last week, including a touchdown. Hunter Henry is going to be one of the go-to guys for Mac Jones, especially in the red zone. And given how many yards Miami gave up last week, Hunter Henry should find himself safely inside the top 12 once again. Now, Juwan Johnson had a very modest game last week, but all offseason long, you drafting him came with the caveat that there was going to be some down performances if he doesn't score a touchdown, because a lot of his upside and a lot of his fantasy output is based on that red zone usage. Maybe Tennessee's defense is just better than what we expected. Maybe Derek Carr was rusty. Maybe this offense just wasn't on the same page yet. And last week, they just weren't able to get themselves in a position to use Juwan Johnson a little bit more often. We'll see if they can figure that out this week. Now, I'm going to keep him in yellow because I still think the more time they spend in the red zone, the more he's going to be utilized. But we need to see that offense start to get a little bit better, a little bit more in sync before we look at Juwan Johnson as being a serious fantasy contributor every single week. And for Hayden Hurst, this might be a tough matchup, but he also could be the #1 target for Bryce Young right now. He could be the guy that sees a majority of the targets, and he could be the guy that Bryce Young looks to when he's having trouble in the pocket and he's just getting pressured way too often. Look for that trend to continue. Now, touchdown-wise, I'm not expecting as many touchdowns that some of the other top tight ends may have. Really, for me, Hayden Hurst is going to be built around saying, hey, we understand that his floor might be 6 points a week, that if he gets enough targets, he's going to be kind of a safer start for us. And then if he scores a touchdown, then he gets inside like the top 6. Our last matchup of the week, the Brown and the Steelers, and David Njoku definitely was the guy that we were a little concerned about this offseason in terms of whether or not he was going to keep up the volume that he saw with Jacoby Brissett. Because when Deshaun Watson came back last year, Njoku moved to more of just like a red zone type of target. And then they added Elijah Moore, who didn't see a ton of work last week, but the work he did see had some big plays associated with it. In fact, a lot of these guys just haven't really separated themselves yet. We assume Amari Cooper will probably still be the #1, but Elijah Moore is quickly ascending. David Njoku could be in that conversation. You still have Donovan Peoples-Jones, and of course, you're going to be running the football. So David Njoku, for me, is still going to be kind of a boomer bust, touchdown-dependent tight end until we see a few more things shake out over the course of the next few weeks. For the Pittsburgh Steelers, Pat Freiermuth would be in green for this matchup if it wasn't for his injury. Now, right now, Mike Tomlin is saying he's optimistic that Freiermuth is going to be out there this week. And given the fact that Deontay Johnson is going to be missing a few weeks with his hamstring injury, that's just going to give a little bit more opportunity to Pat Freiermuth. This matchup, while it still might be on the difficult side, given the Cleveland Browns defense still being a good defense, it might not be nearly as imposing as it was facing the 49ers last week. So for the Pittsburgh Steelers, Pat Freiermuth is a guy that will continue to have that red zone upside, but hopefully the volume ticks up a little bit for him this week. If he is a guy that does end up playing, he's probably going to be just inside my top 12. Yo, Headliner Nation, I appreciate you being here for the tight end video this week. I know it's a mess, but stick with me. We had some really good calls last week, I felt like, and the Hunter Henry call in the offseason of drafting him has worked out really well, but it's only 1 week. We don't want to, we're not taking victory laps yet, ladies and gentlemen. I just want you all to know that we're off to a decent start. The tight end whisperer is here, and he's working hard for you guys. So hit that like button for me. Subscribe to the channel if you are new here. And last but not least, leave me a comment down below and let me know which tight end you think has either a breakout or a bounce back performance here in week 2. Travis Kelce doesn't count. Peace out, Headliner Nation. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.